My pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Karen Levy, who I run into most regularly in Gates Hall waiting for coffee, but have also seen speak on a few occasions now. So Karen has a JD PhD combination and works on really interesting questions about sort of intersections of law and technical things in AI, and what are the types of things that people ought to think about as they're setting up models or setting up computations, if you're trying to think about the legal and ethical dimensions of what your model is. So today she's talking about Robo truckers, and I'm looking forward to a very entertaining talk.
Great, I'll do my best. That's a high bar. I didn't realize entertaining. Informative, maybe. Entertaining, we'll see. Thanks a lot for having me. It's nice to see. Oh, hi, Doug. You just sneak in at the end. It's nice to see some familiar faces and meet other folks. I admit that when David and Phil got in touch about speaking the applied math colloquium, I thought, we must have their own fan meeting because there's nary any applied math to be found in this talk. But I think, as David points out, like in a broad sense, I think it connects to things that you folks do. So I'm excited to share it with you today. I'm also really happy to do this as a little bit more of a conversation. I think given a group this size, that's feasible. So if you have thoughts or comments throughout, or questions or whatever, feel free to let me know and we can do it that way. So I have been studying the trucking industry since 2011. It was the subject of my doctoral dissertation when I got my PhD in sociology. And at long last, like actually more than a decade later, I'm about to publish my book on the topic, December 6, 2022, barring supply chain issues, which seems like a big what if. But finally, the project is kind of coming to fruition. So what I thought I would do today is give you kind of like, first just a brief overview of the project, the kind of broad strokes of the project in the book, and then dig into actually like the final substantive chapter of the book, which is like the most recent one I've been working on, which has to do with autonomous vehicle technology. Okay, so let me, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
There is some noise from the other room. Could you please speak up?
I'll do my best. Yeah, thank you for telling me, and just give me like one of these if you need it. I'll try. Okay, so actually let me start by just asking, is anyone in this room like familiar with the trucking industry? Does anybody have like experience maybe working in the trucking industry or a family member that does? Oftentimes when I give talks about trucking, like the Venn diagram of academic audiences and trucking audiences is like really far from it. Every once in a while somebody has like an uncle. David, do you?
Yes.
What can I ask?
One of my uncles before he retired worked trucking up and down this part of the East Coast.
No kidding. Okay, that's great. Does anyone else? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my mom's in the seafood industry in South Louisiana, and she like helps to run also like the trucking company association.
Oh, so is she a dispatcher?
No, she's not. She's an accountant, but she.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. That's great. Okay, good. So
Very familiar with all that. Yeah.
there's like a tiny little union between the two. But for most folks in the room, maybe I didn't know anything about trucking before I started working on this. My family's not. I'm from Indiana, which has a lot of truckers because there's a lot of highways, but none of my family was involved in trucking, so it was new to me when I started working on it. So I'll give you just like a kind of quick overview of the industry and its political economy and culture. So first, truckers, I sometimes call them human infrastructure because truckers are like just unbelievably essential to the way the economy functions. If you look around this room, very likely everything or nearly everything that you're wearing or that you're touching or that is like in this building was at some point on a truck being driven by a truck driver down the highway. Like there are exceptions, but like there aren't that many exceptions. They touch almost everything. Truckers have this saying, which is if you got it, a truck brought it, right? Which kind of gets at just how essential they are. And yet, like, despite how much we rely on them, especially now, right now that we can like constantly be checking to see where our Amazon packages are, and we expect them really fast. But we tend not to think about truckers all that much, right? They're sort of weirdly, they're like sort of an invisible group of people. And if we do encounter them, we encounter them in sort of this negative way where we're trying to pass them on the highway and we can't get around them, or maybe they have like a negative reputation cities don't want truck parking being built in their town. There's a lot of NIMBYism about trucking infrastructure. But they're really essential, right? There are about 2 million long-haul truckers in the US today. Long-haul truckers are the truckers who drive, it's like more, officially the legal definition is more than 125 air miles from a base. But you can just think of it as like the drivers who are driving long distances down the highway. So not your FedEx driver or UPS driver, like delivery drivers. There's a lot of interesting issues with them too, but they're just not the focus. I mean, we can talk about that if you're interested. But the focus of my study is on the long haul guys. Trucking is a deregulated industry. So in about 1980, up until 1980, the federal government was heavily involved in setting rates in trucking. So they set standardized rates. They have rules about who could enter into the industry and who couldn't. You had to have like a license to operate. And they did away with all that in 1980, which was a big deal. If you're interested, we could talk more about that. But just, it's important background because what it has led to is a highly, highly competitive industry where companies operate on like incredibly thin margins, and they're always looking to cut costs like wherever possible. And one of the things that this has meant is that truck drivers themselves as employees have suffered a lot. So truck drivers made about $110K per year in 1980, and now they make about $47K. Or that's in today's dollars. Both those figures are in today's dollars. So their pay and their quality of life has really plummeted since deregulation, and that number has been stagnant for about 15 years. Like it's barely moved in 15 years. Despite the fact, as you may have heard in the last couple of months especially, that there's a significant truck driver shortage, right? We need a lot more truck drivers, but wages have not been responsive to that. So we have not seen what you might expect, which is that wages would increase in the industry. We've seen some other things happen, which I can talk about if you care. Truck drivers will be very fast to tell you if you say that there's a trucker shortage. They'll say there's not a trucker shortage, there's a wage shortage. Because there are plenty of people with commercial driver's licenses. What there are not is jobs that are willing to pay people what they will accept to do the work. And part of that is because trucking work is like really, really, really bad. Like it's really hard work. Trucking has the 8th highest rate of occupational fatalities in the country. So it's very dangerous work. It's very hard for truckers to stay healthy on the road, right? They're by themselves all the time, right? They don't get to go home every night. They're on the road routinely for weeks, sometimes maybe for months. There's a bunch more that I could say about why it's a hard job. Some people have compared it to sweatshop labor in terms of the amount of pay they make for the amount of work that they do and the amount of risk that they put themselves at, and I think that's a really apt comparison, actually. Okay, despite this, and maybe paradoxically, trucking culture is like very proud. So if you talk to truckers about their work, there's like a real romance about it, right? Like, not obviously there's millions of people in the industry, so this is variable. But I think on the whole, trucking culture is like very proud. When I talk to truckers about why they got into trucking, a lot of them tell me it's because, it was the only job they could find where someone wasn't going to be looking over their shoulder all the time, right? And where they'd have autonomy, where autonomy here means like human autonomy, not machine autonomy, to kind of live their lives as they saw fit or do their jobs as they saw fit without being micromanaged. That was really, really important to the culture of trucking for a very long time. And you'll notice that I often use I'll default to male pronouns when I talk about truckers. And that's because the industry this is a little outdated, it's 94% male, according to the latest BLS statistics. But not only is it mostly male, it is like male. Like masculinity is really, really essential to trucking. If you look at kind of trucker culture, these are old images, of course, from the 70s. But this actually gives you, I still think they're valuable as kind of iconography of the industry, right? So like the notion of the trucker as kind of virile, as like a man, as a person with stamina, as a person whose manliness is like bound up in his work. You can see, I don't know if you've seen it, has anyone seen either of these movies? Oh, we should just do a showing. I should just stop talking and we should just watch Convoy. They're really fun movies to watch. But the notion of like outsmarting law enforcement is kind of bound up in it, right? You can see in Highballin', right, that there's this little, and this is a theme in a lot of trucker movies, is like that Smokey and the Bandit, right? Like Smokey's out to get you and you have to outsmart him in order to get your work done. So this is like kind of fun, but this cultural kind of cowboyism is also really just like a gloss on economic necessity, right? So when you talk to truckers about like the party mentality, very few of them actually view this as like a fun party mentality, right? What they say is like, this is dangerous, difficult, sometimes deadly work, and I work really, really hard, right, in order to put food on the table for my family, keep the lights on, this isn't fun and games for them, right? Like it's a serious job, and this is like a gloss that sort of sits on top of that. Part of the kind of dark side of this is that trucking is very, very tiring work, right? Maybe for reasons that you can unpack for yourself, right? Like driving is tiring. Driving is especially tiring when you're driving like an 80 to 100,000 pound vehicle, and when you're trying to do it really fast. And I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail about this, but truckers are incentivized to drive as much as possible. So there's another rhyming saying in the industry, they love their rhyming sayings, which is if the wheel ain't turning, you ain't earning. So they're only paid by the mile that they drive. They're not paid for any of the time that they spend sitting in traffic or conducting inspections or waiting to be loaded or unloaded at a dock or any eating, right, any of that. They're only paid for the time that they're driving. So they want to keep driving, right? Like obviously you want to keep driving so you can make money. Because of that, they're really, really tired, right? Like so they're driving well past the point of exhaustion in many cases. I'll skip the details on this just for the sake of time, but this is a long-standing problem, and it's one that's only gotten worse post-deregulation. Most of the time, this isn't something that people think about that much either. Probably the most high-profile case of like trucker fatigue that sort of entered the public imagination was in 2014 when Tracy Morgan. You guys know Tracy Morgan? Okay, good. Lots of nods on that one. Finally, we found something that people know. But that Tracy Morgan was involved in this deadly accident between his tour bus and a Walmart driver who had been driving for 28 hours straight at the time of the collision. That's kind of exceptional, but like a lot of accidents have that kind of profile. Okay, now officially it would be illegal to drive 28 hours. It is illegal to drive for 28 hours straight. Again, without going into much detail, a lot of the focus of my book is actually on time in trucking and how truckers keep track of how much time they drive. So since the 30s, there have been laws in place or regulations from the Department of Transportation that cap the number of hours that truckers can drive. You don't have to worry about what the numbers actually are, and they've changed a bit over the years. They're kind of complicated. But what's important is how much they keep track, or excuse me, how they keep track of how much they drive. We can say it's roughly 70 hours a week for our purposes, and that's roughly what it is. Okay. The way that this has been enforced in the past is through documents like this. I could have brought you one, which I didn't think to do. But you can buy a pad of like these little forms that look like this. They're like this big at any way station or truck stop. They cost a couple of bucks. And these are called logbooks. And what you do is you just draw, I mean, we could talk through it if we had more time, but you draw a line that indicates how long you've been driving, how long you've been resting, how long you've been in other kind of work statuses. And at the end of the day, they have to add up to less than the federal minimum, or maximum, excuse me. This is like, it's not hard to figure out. If we sat down and looked at it for 2 minutes, and one of us could pull this out, the issue is that they're also really, really easy to fudge, right? So these documents are not actually connected to the way drivers are paid. These are just regulatory documents. So if they get pulled over by a cop, or if they go through a weigh station, you may have noticed like the weigh stations that trucks sometimes have to pull through, they have to have the last 7 days of these documents handy. But other than that, like this is not connected to how they're paid. So because of that, there's an incentive to still drive a lot, right? Drive as much as your paycheck requires, but to like lie on these documents, basically, to falsify these documents. And it's not hard to do that, right? Like it's pretty easy after you finish it. Some people keep more than one set of logs. Some people will just like fudge around the edges to make it look like a trip took less time than it actually did. There's all kinds of techniques that they use. Drivers will call these sometimes their comic books or their coloring books. Like it is well known in the industry that these are not. Nobody takes these really seriously. Now, as a result, right, if we think that this is a problem, and we think that like, no, we have these timekeeping rules for a reason, and we're concerned about the fact that, like thousands of people a year die in truck-related accidents, like fatigue is a real problem, we might think like, well, we should crack down on these rules. And so the Department of Transportation has adopted that perspective. And since 2017 has mandated what are called electronic logging devices, or ELDs. And the ELD is actually like the centerpiece of the work that I've been doing. Like most of my book is looking at sort of the development of ELDs from a technical perspective, what types of data collection it facilitates, how that changes the relationships that truckers have with their employers and with the government. And what you may have surmised, I didn't say it actually, is that the ELD, which every trucker is required to buy, install, and use, just keeps track of the same types of, you can see the same grid graph in the middle, right? It's a timekeeping device, but it's hardwired into the truck. So the intention is that it's harder to falsify the data. It's actually not impossible to falsify the data. There's a whole chapter in my book about how they falsify the data, but it is harder, right? It's hard. You have to be a little more savvy or a little more motivated to falsify this data. So I've talked to a lot of truckers about electronic logging devices and their views on them. You don't have to read all this. But this just gives you like a little bit of a sense for what some of the things that they have said about them are. They refer to them as their black boxes or their spy boxes. They talk about these boxes being their babysitters. They say that the devices compare them to criminals or to children. They resent having to pay for them. Like, they're not super popular in the industry, which makes sense, right, based on what you know about trucker culture. And part of the reason for that actually has to do with the auxiliary features that are bundled with electronic logging devices. So this is like just something I copied from an ELD manual, or like a, feature sheet. This one's actually old, but they all look kind of like this. And what you can see is that all the stuff I've been telling you about timekeeping, is this hours of service. I don't know if you can read it, but this hours of service line with the arrow next to it, that's all about this regulatory record keeping. Everything else under is something else, right, that's bundled with that technology. And these include things like, real-time tracking of your speed, or how often you change lanes without signaling, or your real-time route and transmitting that back to your employer, or a whole bunch of biometric stuff that I'm going to get into towards the end, or how much fuel you use. That's like huge, right? That's a huge cost driver in the industry. So knowing like how efficiently you're driving, much more fine-grained performance monitoring stuff that's getting transmitted not to the government but back to your employer in real time, right? And that is like just a game changer in trucking, right? Because, right, as I said, this is like the nature of the industry has made it such that truckers were able to evade that kind of oversight for a really long time, and now they're not, right? Because of these auxiliary uses. If we had more time, and I really love talking this through, but we don't really have time. We could talk through, so in one paper in one chapter of my book, I really dig into how this changes managerial dynamics in trucking, and how it gives managers visibility into what truckers are doing, allows them to challenge truckers' narratives about how tired they are, or what the weather is like, or things like that. We're not going to talk about it now. I'm just telling you that it exists. I'm happy to answer questions about it if you want. I also look at kind of how this device challenges a lot of truckers' idea of self-knowledge or stamina, right? I talked about how their bodily autonomy is really sort of central to their occupational identity. And I just wanted to pull out this one quote that I find weirdly prescient. So this was a comment that a trucker made in a comment to the Department of Transportation when they were considering this mandate. And the trucker says, "A computer doesn't know when we are tired, fatigued, or anything else. Any piece of electronics that is not directly hooked up to my body cannot tell me this." Now, this trucker wrote this, I want to say it was 2013 or maybe 2010, I can't remember. Now, obviously, the trucker's point in writing this was not, you know what we should do? You should hook up a piece of electronics directly to my body to tell you whether I'm tired, fatigued, or anything else. That was not where he was going for. And yet, as we will see, that's kind of where things ended up going. Yeah.
I'm curious about the citation at the bottom of the slide.
Yeah.
Because the quotation to me reads as something that a driver of any gender might have expressed.
Yeah.
Do you think it's hypermasculine, or it just happens to be a quote from a paper that has that word in the title?
It's a good question. I mean, this particular quote, I think you're right, could be easily construed, I might say the same thing, right? In that paper, I talked through reasons why this particularly rubs up in a negative way against the notions of masculinity that a lot of truckers have, which have to do, a lot of it has to do with stamina, right? So there's a big culture in trucking and in other industries of if you can't do it, you're not man enough, right? And that's really alive in trucking, the idea that the way we know who's a man is who can stand in the seat for 28 hours. So, yes.
I'm just curious about what was on the slide previous to this, I think. Did that show, is this like an actual dialogue between okay, wow.
Yeah, and if we had time, I would make one of you act it out with me, because it's really, actually, it's really fun, and because it, I think, says a lot about just, the change in the communication strategy. Because before, and I won't go into it now, but before, before cell phones, right, the trucker just kind of called the manager when he felt like it from the payphone, right, or, the trucker was totally in exclusive possession of knowledge about what he was doing. And obviously that's not the case now in ways that really impact the relationship.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, that's the broad strokes of the book. The book is all about this device. It looks at how truckers resist these devices. It looks at kind of how it challenges our notion of political economy and technological solutionism, all kinds of stuff. It was a lot of fun to work on. as I, like, it's taken me a long time to finish this book. As I have been kind of, in the last few years of working on it, I would tell people I was writing a book about trucking and technology, and they would say, oh, okay, like autonomous trucks. And I would say, no, not autonomous trucks. This electronic logging device, which, like, you don't know about or care about. And they would be, like, a little bit disappointed. And I have to admit, like, I got a little anxious. I was like, oh, shit, like, truckers are going to go away, right? Like, soon there will be no more truckers. In this book, I have this, like, long study I've been doing about this device that's being used to monitor them. Might be, like, not that relevant anymore because I took too long to write it, and now trucking looks totally different, and there are no more human truckers. Now, that's obviously not true, but that was, like, I was worried. So I decided to, like, kind of accept the challenge a little bit and to say, like, okay, everybody seems to think this book is going to be about autonomous trucking. What is autonomous trucking really going to do here? Like, does it have any relationship with the study I've been doing, or is it just like something new that's going to sweep everything away? So that's what this last chapter of the book is about, and that's what I'm going to talk a bit more about today. Okay, what time do we end, by the way, David?
3:45.
4:45?
4:45.
Okay, okay. Because, yeah. Okay, okay, what was I going to say? Oh yeah, so what was the reason why people thought I was writing about autonomous trucks and why I thought that that was cause for concern? I mean, it's like not shocking if you've been paying attention to the media that there's a lot of generalized conversation about what jobs are likely to be automated. You know, the robots will take our jobs kind of rhetoric, right, that has been really popular over the last few years and probably like 3 or 4 years ago, I think was maybe at its height. It's tempered a bit since then. But a lot of conversation about this generally, and empirical, or excuse me, economic studies, right, academic work about what jobs are likely to be automated. We have been here before, right, so economists have long written about what's often called skill-biased technological change, right, so the idea that, you know, when new technologies emerge, they do change employment, right, they change who has jobs, but they don't just do that equally across the board, right, like so oftentimes what happens is that they disproportionately negatively impact low-wage work, like trucking in this case. Well, they either don't affect or may even improve the conditions of high-wage work. Historically, the primary, this is I don't know if folks know this paper, this is a paper written in, I think, 2003 by a set of economists looking at this in a prior wave. Historically, kind of the axis of distinction that people paid attention to was whether a job was manual or cognitive, right? So the thinking was kind of like, well, you know, on the factory floor, if you're doing a lot of stuff with your body, machines can probably take that over. But if you're doing like stuff with your brain, machines are not yet good at that, right? So those jobs are going to be safer. And then over time, and in this paper, in fact, as computerization kind of improves, economists start to say that in fact what matters is not only whether work is manual or cognitive, but also whether it consists of routine or non-routine tasks, right? So these are just heuristics, of course, right? But these were kind of like the heuristics that people used to predict what jobs were likely to be impacted by technology. So this, in this 2003 paper, right, actually the thinking is that truck driving is going to be safe because trucking consists of a lot of manual tasks, but a lot of driving is kind of considered to be, at this point, right, non-routine, right, that this is the sort of thing where you're constantly reacting to new stimuli, and that something that would be maybe like less safe would be something where there's like a really clear set of rules, right, that can be implemented and followed repetitively, and the thinking is like, well, those jobs might go away. Over time, though, as folks in this room well know, the technology changes, and in 2013, kind of, you know, facing down like the potential wave of new machine learning driven technology, there's this other really influential paper which people may have seen, or like this paper got like a bunch of popular, it was very influential in both policy and in the popular press, by Carl Benedict Fry and Michael Osborne, a machine learning researcher and an economist. And they say, actually things are different now again. And what they did a study that I won't go into a bunch of details about like the methods that they use, but they basically say, you know, what matters now is like less routine versus non-routine work. And instead what matters is creativity, right? So jobs that require a lot of creative input, they think are going to be safe. But a lot of jobs, they say, in the face of new AI-driven technologies are not going to be so safe anymore. And so this paper, a lot of people have kind of, I don't know if you can debunk the prediction, but a lot of people have kind of come along and challenged the findings of this paper, but it was very influential at the time. And they make like really broad claims on the basis of these predictions, and they say 47% of US jobs are at significant risk of being automated away within the next decade, or decade or 2 decades, I can't remember what it was. And one of the jobs that they think is actually most at risk is trucking. So this is a graphic that NPR put together, basically just taking all their data and like running it through this cute little graphic. And they say heavy and tractor-trailer truck drivers have a 78.6% chance of being automated away in the next several years. The White House picked this up too. In 2016, the White House issues this like big report on AI and automation in the economy that forecasts that basically truck drivers will like cease to exist in their current form. That they say 80 to 100% of drivers will be significantly impacted by AI technologies over the next several years. So there's a lot of like this creates a lot of fear, right? Like yeah, go ahead, David.
So can you go back one?
Yeah.
Something about the abstract just struck me.
What's
So this is based on, I'm reading that second sentence
Yeah.
where they say, to assess this, we begin by implementing a novel methodology to estimate the probability of computerization using a Gaussian process classifier. Do you have any idea what?
I don't know what that means. No, I don't know what that means. I can tell you what I know that they did. I don't know what the Gaussian process classifier.
Okay, I'm curious what they did.
So they took this. There's this data. It's called ONET data. Do you know what the ONET data? It's data that the federal government puts together that classifies jobs into tasks. So it says like the job of professor consists of these 30 tasks or whatever it is. I don't know why they do it, but they do it. They've done it for a long time. So what they did was they took, I think it was a panel of machine learning experts, and they asked them which of these tasks are automatable. And then based on the task composition of jobs, they said, okay, these jobs are in danger. It's a little coarse, right? And like, there's been a lot of critique of that. But some people thought, I mean, the White House was good enough for the White House, right? So they got really concerned about it. This paper has a lot of citations. But yes, I agree. Like that doesn't, obviously it doesn't do justice to like anything social or cultural or legal, not to mention, questions about it. Just, whether something can happen based on task composition is a very different question about whether the job will actually go away. But yes, I don't know about I don't even know what Gaussian classifier means.
I wasn't expecting to see it that way.
Yeah. Anyway, the point is, right, like people get very anxious about this notion of like the robot apocalypse, right? Like people, including in trucking, start to get a little bit worried about this. Because, of course, if you replace this nearly 2 million person population, right, of people, many of whom, so these are the most common jobs in every state. And you can see these 29 states are like the aqua. I don't know if you can really read it, it's hard to read. But the most common job in 29 states is truck driver. And you can, they're actually, a little bit of this is like a bit of an artifact. This is also BLS data, and they like classify people weirdly. But it still, I mean, the major point remains, I think, which is that, somebody who lives in Iowa maybe doesn't have, at this point at least, right, like there's a lot of concern that people don't have a lot of alternative employment options. If all of these people lose their jobs in short order, that could be like major economic crisis. And it may be that trucking is an industry that's ripe for this kind of disruption, right? I just finished telling you about what crappy work it is, right? Like nobody seems to want to do it, right? There's this big labor shortage, but we really need someone to do it. Human truckers are so tired. They have these accidents, they do these illegal things. There's a lot of cost savings, potentially associated with removing labor costs from trucking. So there's a lot of, and then as we all know, right, there's a lot of technical progress in autonomous vehicles that maybe makes this an industry that's like ready to be disrupted. Okay, so we start to see really sudden, massive investment in autonomous vehicles generally and in autonomous trucks specifically. We see market studies predicting that the global AV market will increase like tenfold from 2019 to 2026. I don't know how well that's borne out, but a lot of excitement and investment here. There are a bunch of interesting kind of demonstration projects. Auto, which is I think now defunct. Auto ran this demo. Auto was an autonomous truck outfit that ran this demo where they drove, I think it was 25,000 cans of Budweiser from like, I forget where it was, from Colorado to Arizona or Texas or something. So they do this like very well publicized thing, right, about like the first autonomous truck delivery of beer. Of course, what they don't show you in the video, right, is that this truck is accompanied by like I actually have it written down, 4 state patrol cars, 3 company vehicles, and 2 tow trucks. So like it's obviously a demonstration, right, so it's fine. But it's not as sustainable, right? Like there's a little more hype than there is anything to actually back it up. You can't have that many vehicles for your everyday beer run. But notice like what, oh yeah, go ahead, Bobby. Did you
In
have
their
a beer
defense,
question?
in their defense, they did get a truck to drive all
They
the way
did it.
from
They did
Colorado
do
to
it.
Texas
Yeah.
without a driver behind the wheel. So
They-
like great that they had all that safety on hand, but it's not like it's a trivially easy task.
Oh yeah. This was not like some Wizard of Oz. It didn't really happen. Like it happened, but it happened with a lot of support.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Okay, so just notice kind of like what's happening in this narrative, right? So in a system like, you know, the auto beer delivery, or in the AV as it's sort of being constructed by people who are worried about jobs, the reason that this is like a threat, right, or could be perceived as a threat, is because of this idea that the trucker is like displaced both economically and physically from the cab, right? The trucker is not in the cab anymore. This is an image from Rolling Stone a couple of years ago. I can't remember what year, 2018 maybe, which I think like makes it quite literal, right? This idea that the trucker is like by the side of the road, right? He doesn't have a paycheck anymore. He's not in the seat anymore. He's been kind of rendered redundant or irrelevant by this new technology. And this is what gives rise to this fear of sector-wide unemployment. Okay, so that's kind of like one side of the story. The title of my talk is like the double threat of AI and trucking, so that's like one of the threats, right, is this threat of unemployment. As maybe emerged from the way I've been talking about this, I am skeptical, and I think people are increasingly skeptical, that this is like actually going to happen in the way that Fry and Osborne or the 2016 White House were worried that it would happen. It certainly hasn't been unfolding at the pace that people have been projecting, and there are a bunch of reasons for this, right? Among them are, first of all, like most of the time, technology changes jobs. It hardly ever changes jobs in like a sudden phase shift. It's much more common that there's like a slope, right? Like a slope, not a cliff, where what happens is jobs change in the face of technology, but it's very unlikely that they just get totally wiped out. We can find counterexamples, but in most cases they don't get totally wiped out. And in the context of something like trucking, this is like almost certainly not going to be what happens. So a couple of reasons for this. One of them is that if you look at truck driving looks like it's about driving a truck. It's right there in the name. But in fact, truck driving consists of a lot of other stuff that maybe isn't officially accounted for in the breakdown of the task that it looks like a truck driver engages in, right? So truckers change their tires, right? Like truckers secure their loads on the back of a flatbed, or make sure that their goods are at the right temperature, or they interface with customers, or when you get to a delivery, it's kind of like when you go to the airport, right? Like you have to taxi around to find like a terminal to stop at. That can take hours actually, right? And some of this stuff could be automated away, or we could come up with alternative ways for people to do it. But some of it is not going to get automated so quickly, right? There's also a bunch of like legal and social reasons. Let me skip this just for time. Which is in part based on the fact that people have a lot of hesitation around autonomous vehicles and autonomous trucks specifically. So in surveys, something like 70% of people say that they are really anxious to get behind the wheel of an autonomous truck or to be on the road with, or autonomous car, excuse me, or to be on the road with one. People probably know that there's like a fair amount of resistance around autonomous vehicle testing. There have been some very high-profile accidents involving autonomous vehicles. Some of this stuff will change, right? Like culture changes, people's fears change over time. But it doesn't tend to change all of a sudden, right? It changes gradually. I put up this overdrive. Has anybody seen Maximum Overdrive? Yes! One guy. Good. Has anyone seen Duel? One guy for Duel. Okay. So Duel is like Steven Spielberg's first movie, I think. And Maximum Overdrive is Steve Wooden's first movie.
Really terrifying. Probably one
Scary.
of the scariest movies I've seen in my life.
Thank you. This is my point, right? Like, there's a reason why we make horror movies about like unmanned trucks with like a taste for blood, right? Like obviously it's a little bit different, but there's a fear factor there, right? Like that's scary. If people are scared of an autonomous car in their neighborhood, an autonomous truck that is 80 to 100,000 pounds barreling down the highway is like terrifying, right? And maybe legitimately so. So there's a lot of concern about that. There's also a bunch of legal stuff I won't bore you guys with about integration of different state laws, about how we would even regulate autonomous trucks. I'll skip that because I'm a lawyer and I even get bored with it, so I don't think you guys are going to care that much. But anyway, the point is that we should expect to see at best gradual change. Now, if we accept that, if you accept my premise that this is going to be, not this phase shift, but this kind of slope of integration, the important question ends up being, what does that integration look like? Like, what will it mean for truckers over the short to medium term to integrate their work with this changing technology. And so that's actually what I'm going to talk about for the last few minutes of the talk, and I'm going to have to skip some stuff, but that's okay. Okay, so if there were truckers, what does it look like for truckers' work to change? I'm going to tell you about 3 possible models of integration. I will just give you the spoiler alert that actually the one that I think is happening is the last one. So the first 2 are kind of like foils for the last one. But I'll still tell you about them. So the first one is the notion of the handoff. And this is something that emerges in human-robot interaction more generally, so you may have heard about this. The idea behind the handoff is that a human and a machine kind of like pass the baton back and forth, right? Like the human does that to which the human is best suited, and the robot does that to which the robot is best suited. You could think about this in the context of like robot surgery, right? Like the human does parts of it that are better for the human to do, and the robot does parts of it that are better for the robot to do. This picture has nothing to do with that at all. I just like the picture. I just find it funny because it doesn't look like that. But the idea behind the handoff model is that it's kind of great for everybody, right? Because the like dirty or boring parts of the work get accomplished by the machine. The person gets to keep, this is the thinking, right? The person keeps their job, and they get to do like the fun parts of the job only, right? Or the more stimulating parts of the job only is kind of the conversation about it. I won't go into a bunch of detail about this. Do people know about like the Society of Automotive Engineers levels of autonomy? Is that like some people, most people know? Okay, we're not going to go into it in depth. Basically, the only point I want you to take from this is, so the Society of Automotive Engineers has a way of categorizing how much autonomy is in vehicles and how much they require human interaction. You don't need to know what they are, you just need to know that they exist. And the reason I bring it up is because we already think about stuff like the handoff in some sense when we think about these levels of autonomy. So like when you have one of those cars that has adaptive cruise control, or a car that will like help you parallel park or something, that's kind of an example of the handoff in some sense, right? Like you're kind of handing off a little bit some of the work of driving to the vehicle, right? And then it's handing it back to you for other things. This ends up though, like what ends up being complicated with autonomous vehicles, and maybe even intractably so, is the idea of like whose job it is to decide when the handoff is going to happen. Is that your job as the driver, or is that the car's job as the car? So this is the reason. This is kind of where autonomous vehicle development is. I don't want to say it's stuck, but this is kind of like the intractable problem that a lot of people are having around level 2 and 3, which is kind of where we are like with Tesla. So the idea that like somebody has to be what the term is monitoring the driving environment to decide when the human needs to respond. Now the thinking in trucking about the handoff is that what would happen is that the truck would kind of handle the bulk of the driving, but when the truck has a problem, right, when the truck detects something in the road or whatever it is, right, like go through a high traffic area, it hands it off to the human. What is the human doing while the truck is driving? These are some ideas, right? So the American Trucking Association, which is the largest trade association in trucking, says if drivers are unshackled from the wheel, they could do order processing, inventory management, customer service, and sales. A product manager at Auto, before it went under, said, while the truck drives, the human driver can nap and relax, chat with family and friends, learn a second trade, or run a business, right? So it's very like, blue sky, digital Athens idea that like you are freed up to just like chill out. Now, in trucking, like one natural question would be, if the driver still has to be there, you still have to pay him. So like, where is the cost savings, right? Like that's not exactly clear. Nobody has quite worked that out yet. But even more fundamentally, there's just a much bigger problem with the handoff model, which you maybe already know about or anticipated, which is that people are just really terrible at this kind of work. Like people are bad cognitively at accepting a handoff in an emergency. So keep in mind, right, the handoff is likely to happen in the hardest driving situations, right? The one that the machine cannot handle. Do you know how long it takes for a human to regain control of the vehicle from zero, like from paying no attention? You should guess. Somebody guess.
10 seconds.
10 seconds.
Very close, 17 seconds. Too long, right? Too long. In an emergency situation, like you don't have 17 seconds. In some ways, planes are actually like better for this, right? Because if you're in a plane, I hate to think about this because I'm afraid of flying, but you have a lot more time to kind of regain control. You do not have that. Accidents on the highway are like a matter of milliseconds often. Okay, I'll skip a lot of this, but there's a lot of really interesting work in cognitive studies and psychology, in human-robot interaction about kind of what's sometimes called this irony of automation. which is, as Lysanne Bandridge says, by taking away the easy parts of the task, automation makes the hard parts of the task more difficult. Somebody else who works at Human Factors calls this the hours of boredom and moments of terror problem. People can't just like sit there doing nothing, being like, will an emergency happen? Like you get, it's called vigilance decrement. You get tired, you stop paying attention. There are a bunch of really interesting studies called the Mackworth studies from the 1940s about radar, people who were supposed to monitor radar, that demonstrate this, right? That if you're just staring at the radar, like waiting for the important blip, after about 10 minutes, like you just can't do it anymore, right? Like your response time really suffers. And so there's a lot of concern that this is like a really, really difficult and maybe intractable problem in autonomous driving. Okay, that's one model. Second model, I feel like I'm going fast because I'm going to get to the end. Okay, second model, what if we thought about not breaking up the driving task in quite the granular way that the handoff model requires, but instead thinking of it more in terms of like, you know, if David and I go on a road trip, I'm going to say like, okay, well, David, I'll drive from here to Syracuse, and then you pick it up and drive from Syracuse to Toronto or whatever it is. Like we divide up the route, right? And that means that we hand off still, but our handoffs are like safe, right? And they're regular, and we can plan for them, right? They're not immediate. So this idea that we divide up the route is another possibility. That still means there's a period where David is totally driving, right? But there's a period where I'm totally driving, and there's no point at which I'm going to like say, I'm done, David, like you take over, right? Like that's never going to happen. So that's kind of the thinking, is that it obviates some of the problems with the handoff model. It does require that the truck be able to kind of be fully autonomous without human intervention for some period of time. But there are places in the country where we could do that, right? Like as Bobby points out, with this delivery from Colorado. Actually, the American West is one of the safest places for autonomous trucks, to drive, because the roads are pretty straight, it doesn't rain, you know, it's good weather, stuff like that. So it's kind of a lumpy situation. Like there are places where we know, like the last mile is really hard for autonomous trucks, but humans can handle that part. Okay, what do I want to tell you about this? Uber kind of bought into this model a few years ago. They were sort of planning like a hub and spoke design, where what they would do is they would create these exchanges around the country. Here's a picture of what it was going to look like. These autonomous truck ports, they would have trucks do these long hauls, and then they would have human drivers, you know, using like very Uber-y technology, pick up loads and then drive that load the last mile, right? And the thinking was like, this is a way to kind of get the best of both worlds, right? I talked to Uber, this was in like, I want to say it was 2018 when they were doing this. I talked to Uber at the time, and I have to admit to you, like when I found out I was talking to Uber about this, I was like not expecting to like this model because Uber doesn't have like a great history with labor generally. But actually I kind of thought like, okay, this is not bad, right? Like it could be really advantageous for truckers to drive more local routes, right? To do more driving that's not going to fatigue them in the same way that long haul driving does. Right? Like this could actually be good. So I talked to them, I ended up having this like stupid quote in the Atlantic where I said, oh, you're the worst, and they printed it for some reason. And I made this point there, which I'll just say here, which is that part of the reason this seems sort of appealing was that obviously, like I told you, truckers only get paid by the mile, right? So truckers, basically what Uber was proposing to do would take away most of the time, like most of the labor for which truckers are paid. That seems terrible, except that truckers have long, you know, tried to get the federal government to intervene to change the pay structure in trucking so that they're paid like for the time that they work, for example. And they've never been successful. Uber is so powerful, right, especially in 2018, it was so powerful that I kind of thought, and others thought this too, maybe this is like a strange bedfellow situation where for Uber to get what it wants, it maybe has to push the feds to actually change the pay structure in trucking. And if they do that, right, like if they actually, and this is what I suggested to them, but it came to naught, that if they were willing to kind of push on the regulatory front as well, this actually could end up being like a wonderful situation for truckers. But of course, nothing happened because shortly thereafter, Uber shutters its truck group. There's a bunch of reasons they did this, many of which have to do with like their lawsuit with Waymo, so we won't go into it now. But basically, they said they gave up. They said we're not going to do this anymore. I think this would have been a huge lift for Uber. There are some startups that are talking about doing something like this now, but I just don't really see it as being in the cards for anybody, for any small startup, because the infrastructure required to create the model would be like really, really significant. So I kind of think this is not going to happen. Okay, what do I think is going to happen in the last 5 minutes? I'll tell you. Okay, so what do we actually see happening in trucking? Like, how do we actually see AI being felt in the labor of trucking today? Well, so what we actually see happening is truckers and machines integrating into one another. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I'm going to skip this for time. I'm going to skip this for time. I'm going to show you this. Okay, this is a cartoon from a trucking magazine I read called Landline. Yeah, okay, sorry. I don't know. I just got mesmerized by the guy for a second. It's accompanied by, it goes with this article that says something about Robo truckers. So it's where I got the title for this talk. It's called The Rise of the Robo Trucker or something like that. This is obviously a caricature, right? This is a cartoon showing a bunch of kind of imaginary technologies to which truckers could be subject, like a coffee fuel injector or a vibrating butt warmer. These are obviously exaggerated, but they are actually only barely exaggerated. Some of them actually do sort of exist. And I'll tell you a little bit more about some of these technologies. So these are often marketed kind of under the umbrella of fatigue detection or fatigue management devices, sometimes what are called lone worker monitoring devices. So let me tell you what these are. I'll just give you a little tour of some of them. This is from a company called Seeing Machines. Seeing Machines markets cameras that are trained on the driver's face. They're integrated into the electronic logging device that I told you about at the beginning. And what they do is they detect eyelid flutter, and I think also head movement. So if you start to get tired and you nod off, what it will do is there's different setups. You can have one that flashes lights in your eyes. It'll sound an alarm. It'll tell your boss. My favorite one actually. There's one that comes with a seat cushion that vibrates to sort of boost you back into alertness when you start to fall asleep. But it does all these things to try to wake you back up when you get too tired. This is Mercedes-Benz has a vest that they're working on, or they were working on, they may not be doing it anymore, that monitors the trucker's heart rate. And if a trucker starts to have a heart attack, it'll pull the truck over. This is something called a smart cap. It's a baseball cap. There's several companies in this space. They run a constant EEG on the trucker to monitor their brain waves to detect fatigue or other disruption. And it'll flash, again, flashlights in your eyes if you start to get tired, things like that. There's a bunch. This is a headset called Maven Machines that detects whether you're checking your mirrors as much as they think you should be, etc. Right? There's a lot of these. There's one that's out of Latvia called Steer that's a wristband that will give you an electric shock if you get tired. A small electric shock, but an electric shock nonetheless. So, okay, so let me close by just kind of let's just take a minute, right, to notice the distance between these two narratives, right? We were talking about displacement, right? The notion that what autonomy or what AI could be doing in trucking is taking these people out of the cab, right, which would be bad for them. This other story that's actually what's kind of happening on the ground more is very different, right? The trucker's still in the cab, the trucker still has his job. He's just being joined in the cab, right? He has this partner in the cab, which is this technology that is on or almost even in his body, right? It's it's this very intimate incursion of the technology into his work. I'm not telling you that that's good or bad, right? This is just descriptive. But we should notice how different these two things are, right? And that they're both real, right? These are both real threats to the work that people are doing. So what does this tell us about kind of how to think about AI and labor? I think one thing it tells us is that we tend to have a conversation about AI and work in terms of how many people will lose their jobs. And we should definitely think about that. But we should also think about what happens to the people who keep their jobs, right? What is the quality of that job? What is the dignity that's associated with that job? Is it worse work, right, because of the way that they're integrating work with technology? And then the other thing I think it tells us, and maybe this is just me kind of saving my ass a little bit with the book, is that, I told this whole story about trucking and surveillance, and I kind of, I think, naively thought oh, well, automation is going to do away with surveillance because there won't be people to surveil anymore. That's obviously not true, right? We shouldn't think of automation and surveillance as substitutes. We should think of them as complements because autonomous systems are almost always going to still require, no matter what the system, right? They will almost always still require a human to do something, right? A human has to be part of the system. A human has to be a cog that fits. And because humans are humans, the way we make people do that is often through surveillance, right? It's often through collecting data about them to make them behave in the way that they need to. So we should always expect, right, that there's going to be some aspect of surveillance or data collection about humans in order to play well as kind of part of this part of this apparatus. Again, this isn't just, this image I've shown at the bottom is actually like, this is also relevant not only for truckers, but for commercial vehicles, right? So there's a lot of conversation in NHTSA, the federal regulator now, about the degree to which we monitor drivers in semi-autonomous vehicles to ensure that they're paying attention, right? So like you may have heard about this with Tesla, the idea that you like have to have your hands on the wheel, or the use of cameras like the ones I told you about to make sure that people are alert and prepared to take over from the car. My suggestion isn't that we shouldn't do those things, right? My suggestion is just that we should make sure we have a conversation about privacy as we have the conversation about autonomy, because they're always going to flow together. So that's what I've got for you today. Thank you for dealing with some definitely not applied math. And yeah, I'm happy to chat or take questions.
So you mentioned a couple of times, usually by way of contrast, the other massive transport system, which is the air system, where automation plays an enormously different role, and the labor culture is different. From, I don't know either one well enough to say this authoritatively, but it sounds like the labor culture in the transport industry, at least for pilots, is probably better than for truckers. Can you say, is there, clearly the two have evolved differently, but you know, automation is playing an increasing role in each. Is there a version of the world in which truckers become more like pilots, or is it just two different technology or two different social situations?
That's a super good question, and I don't know a ton about pilots either. I mean, I know they face some of the same issues, especially around like this idea of handoff, right? Like, so I know pilots get like training in order to ensure that like their skills don't degrade over time, because the less often you have to actually fly the plane, the less good you're going to be at flying the plane. And that's the same part of the same concern that arises in the handoff in the vehicle, except that we don't have the same training infrastructure, right? So like, if to get a CDL, any one of us, if this whole grad school thing doesn't work out, you can go get your CDL. Or, you know, David, if you need a fourth job on top of the job, I think it takes like 8 weeks or something. And actually states are constantly, they just lower the driving age in a bunch of states from 21 to 18 because there aren't enough people to do this work. You do not want an 18-year-old behind the wheel. You just don't. Like, that's a terrible idea, right? Like but we keep doing this. We keep coming up with ways to like try and churn more people into the industry. What is my point? Oh, my point is only that like I don't think we can expect the kinds of like continuing ed is the wrong word for it, but sort of continued training that pilots are able to get to sort of keep them you know responsive, right, or keep their skills alive. It's a good question though. Yeah.
So we're talking about the advance of technology in transport, right? And this has happened very often in history. So we didn't use a car. We have cars now.
Yep.
Trains used to have horses in the front to make sure they don't go too fast. How do you think the case for trucking compare with these historical cases?
Oh, that's a really good question. Nobody's ever asked me that question. So how should we think about trucking differently given previous historical examples of transport specifically? Ooh. I don't know, what do you think? I'm sorry, I don't mean to be glib about it. I actually don't know all that much about the development of the railroad system, for example.
Just sort of a follow on, I was just wondering, is it the case that the capital investment is by the private individual, like these independent truckers pay for the vehicles? So like if I wanted to automate, I have to buy a fleet of trucks, I have to retrofit them, and I have to maintain, operate, and do everything for them. That seems like a high cost of admission. Whereas here, you're pushing it off onto the person you're underpaying, letting them take all the risk and liability, and you get, why would you change that?
Yeah, it's a good point. So it's, there's a really good book by like the other sociologist who studies trucking, Steve Baselli. There's kind of like, we try never to be in the same place because what if something happened? He's a very nice guy though. But he has this wonderful book called The Big Rig, which is not so much about technology in trucking, but it's about like employment arrangements in trucking. And the big rig is a joke, right? Because it's the rig is that like people are encouraged to buy and maintain their own trucks, as you say. there's more, people are sort of sold on the dream of becoming independent contractors in trucking who can like run their own show. But in reality, like it's a terrible investment, like just an awful investment. And what has happened is just more consolidation, right? So big companies that, like people just can not really afford to do that in the way they could in the 80s. So more and more companies are maintaining the trucks, but you're right, and there are all kinds of terrible lease arrangements and stuff that they use to try to exploit drivers in this way. Yes?
From talking to truckers, do you have a sense of if they like voluntarily like these technological advances, do they like want to voluntarily take on something that's going to stop them from being tired?
Say that last part one more time.
Like, do you have a sense of these truckers appreciate these things that are going to stop them from getting too tired, or is it more like the companies are forcing them to get it and they continue to resent that?
So I'm so glad you brought this up. So the question, I don't know if people can hear the question. The question is like, I mean, presumably truckers also don't want to die. Right? In some sense, everyone's interest is aligned because like they don't like driving for 28 hours straight. They don't like being tired. They resent, I think, being told what to do or being told that they don't know their own bodies or their own limits. But in some sense, like nobody wants them to die, right? Like nobody wants that. I think the issue is not that, like, and I don't want that either, right? Like in writing about them and in trying to like give voice to their concerns, it's not that I think like, you know what you should get to do is work more in the sweatshop than you already do. Instead, I think the issue is like, if we're concerned about trucker fatigue, there are ways we could deal with that that don't actually involve shocking someone back into alertness when they fall asleep. Like what we should do is just pay them for their work, right? Obviously. And it's a classic case, which this happens all the time, right? Where we have some problem that has to do with social organization or politics or the economy, and instead of actually fixing it, we're like, well, let's just put some technology on it. Like we'll put a tech Band-Aid on it, which ends up disproportionately impacting the people with the least power in the industry, right? They're the laborers, as you point out. And like we don't actually change the conditions that are making them that tired to begin with. And there are things we could do to do that. I have like this much hope that that might change because for the very first time, so Pete Buttigieg is the Department of Transportation Secretary now, and he is at least giving lip service to this. Like he's saying like, oh, you know what? He called it like filling a leaky bucket. He was like, by kind of like creating these rules that get more people into this terrible job before they get spit out, like maybe what we should do is make the job better. Which is like nice to at least hear a federal official acknowledge that. I don't know if it will happen. So in the meantime, this is what we get, right? We get these rules that just try to keep people awake. Yeah.
Just as a follow-up, are there any studies that even show that these things are effective?
No. No. This is a great question. This is a great question. So without going into like too much detail, I wrote a whole book about this. No, and some of it is really intuitive. So like if I tell you, guess what? You have 11 hours, which is like a trucker's day usually, to drive from here to, what's 11 hours away? I only know like Indianapolis because my family was there. Roughly 11 hours.
Probably about it. Chicago.
Chicago, fine. It doesn't really matter where it is. If I tell you you have 11 hours, give or take, to drive from here to Chicago, you know, you'll drive to Chicago. And like if you have to go to the bathroom, you'll go to the bathroom. And if you hear something weird on your vehicle, you'll stop and check it out. If I tell you like you have 11 hours to get from here to Chicago, and like to visit your grandma, and if you don't get there in exactly 11 hours, she'll write you out of her will. Like, will you drive safely? Of course you won't. You'll speed, and that is what is happening, right? Like, the more we monitor these drivers and try to, like, the tighter watch we keep on them, they are not penalized, right, for speeding, right? What they're penalized for is going over these time limits. So, as with anything, right, like if you remove the flexibility from, but you don't actually change the incentives, right, then what has happened it's just that we see that the number of speed-related crashes has actually increased since these rules were put into place. I could tell you, we could talk much more about this if you want. Yes, go ahead.
To follow up on this seems like a very common pitfall where people instituting some, technological innovation do not take into account how it changes the behavioral patterns of the users. Mm-hmm. And as a result, something which was bad becomes worse somewhere else. The balance is not clear. Do you see any attempts by the companies which are producing that innovation to predict the feedback loop based on the changing behavior?
That is a really good question. I have not. There are some, this is not your question, there are some attempts that companies make to differentiate, so that these devices, not all of the cameras and the shockers and stuff is required. Like that stuff's not required by law, but some of this monitoring is required by law. So it used to be that companies would differentiate themselves a little bit based on whether or not they have these things in their trucks. And I have like ads that I've copied in my book where people say like, we treat you like a grown-up and we don't have these ELD devices, and now they can't do that anymore. But they still do some of that differentiation where they kind of say like, we'll give you as much autonomy as the law allows us. There was a really interesting company called FELD, which was like, you know what it was. I don't know if this is being recorded. Where actually they had a super interesting model that, I won't go into a bunch of depth about it, but they were like, okay, well, we know that you guys do not want to buy this thing. We know you hate it. So what we'll do is we will make the least, like, we'll do the bare minimum. You can buy the bare minimum, it's cheaper. And it was specifically designed to be confusing for law enforcement to interface with. It's like genius, right? Because for a while there were no requirements, that, like there were no standards about what the interface needed to look like, and some of the devices had clocks that counted up and some had clocks that counted down. This has all probably been resolved by now. But they were like, yeah, we'll purposely build this crappy thing that nobody likes as kind of like a F to the ELD. And I mean, this is not your question, but I did like seeing kind of this market differentiation based on this, you know, this knowledge that people were not going to like these things. Yeah.
You showed the set of statistics that the ELD collects,
Yeah.
and it seemed like about 10 times as many different things as were reported on the logbook.
Yeah.
Whose idea was it to collect all of those others, and is it actually being used to
Oh,
know
yeah.
the trackers?
Oh yeah, it's definitely being used. So it's feeding into a bunch more performance management and like predictive analytics. So I mean, I kind of think of it as this, right? It's like if the government said, okay, everybody has to buy a phone that makes calls. Like we would all buy a phone that makes calls, but we would also buy a phone that does all these other things, because you almost like can't buy a phone that doesn't also do other things, right? Like the government never said everybody also has to be able to text and like get online. But like the features are bundled, so like what choice do you have but to buy this thing that has all this auxiliary capability? So when it was like kind of a windfall in some ways for trucking companies, because they had to buy this thing anyway, but they were going to realize a bunch more value from what they now knew about their fleets. The little guys didn't realize that value, right? So this was most valuable to companies that had thousands of trucks. And especially for owner-operators, right, that you were talking about, like they saw no value from this because they already knew where they were, right? They already knew how fast they were driving. So in many ways, this like just operated to help consolidate the industry further. Oh yeah.
This is a question about the future. One problem with trucking is that they have to drive these long hauls where they essentially do nothing, and hence the companies do not want to pay them for that. And then they have, for the drivers, they have to like stay awake for the whole time. So I wonder if technology is so advanced that there can be these avatar truck drivers where they wear like VR goggles and they drive from the safety of their home. Then they can switch drivers along the way without having people to sit behind the wheels.
Yeah.
Do you think that would be feasible, and how do you think that would change the game? Will people like it?
That's a great question. So there are some companies that have tried to do something like this. The most famous one, or the biggest one, was called Starsky Robotics, like Starsky and Hutch, Starsky Robotics. And they went under, and the guy, actually the CEO wrote a really interesting blog post when they went under, but it was the same idea. It wasn't VR, but it was like remote operation. And the idea was what you suggest, right, that people could like swap in and out, or that truckers could like, you know, maybe even operate more than one vehicle that was like in all different parts of the country. Part of what he wrote was that basically the technical problem was much harder than they could solve, right, that like there was just no substitute for actually being behind the wheel of the truck. I don't know enough about the technology to know, I mean, I trust that that was probably actually what they found. But it has been attempted, right, for the reasons that you suggest, because that does seem like it might solve some of the problems. It's not clear that it's technically feasible.
So, given the time, maybe let's take further questions offline, and thank Garrett again for my